they relate to our understanding of eschatology, end time events, and lessons to be learned therefrom, both at the public health and spiritual level. So I want to welcome you all, and I want to introduce Dr. Carmita Duglin, who will be giving this health talk, looking at the history of infectious pandemics down through the relatively modern era. So God bless you all. Welcome and good evening, Dr. Carmita Duglin. So over to you as you begin this last lecture of camp, last health lecture before we go into our closing ceremony. Welcome to you and welcome to all. Sister Duglin.
Okay, good evening, everyone. It's really good to be able to give this health presentation. I was actually thinking about it for a while because sometimes it seems as though we have forgotten what has happened in the past, in our history. And even the idea of taking so long for us to start wearing masks and start putting some measures in place, these things were in place from the 1800s when they experienced similar pandemics. So I just thought I'll pull it together and present it. I'm not sure that I will actually get to the spiritual aspect, so I will leave that to Dr. Duglin as he conclude to deal with any spiritual aspects. But I just wanted to start with Matthew 24, 6-8 in the New King James Version. In his Sermon on the Mount, Olivet, Jesus warned his disciples that they would hear of wars and rumors of wars. And he said, see that you are not troubled. And a lot of our people are actually being very troubled and depressed, etc. For all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet come. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And there will be famines and pestilences, similar to what we are seeing now, and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. So it's not quite the end yet, as Dr. Duglin mentioned today in his sermon, but we can expect to see more things like this as we continue. So I'm going to take you through a brief history and also give you some definitions to help you along the way. So outbreaks of infectious diseases are occurring with increasing frequency and can be unpredictable. As you know, none of us last year camp predicted that this is how we would spend this year camp. Basically, virtual, doing most of the stuff online, even though in the nick of time we were able to get into the church. But let's say this was back in March, April, we would have been doing everything online. So to understand a little bit about infectious diseases, as I mentioned, we will travel back in time. Initially, disease was thought to be caused by evil spirits. Even in Bible times, you would hear that alluded to, that disease was either caused by evil spirits or by divine intervention. It's either something evil caused it or God caused it. But really, the revolution in all of medicine, and particularly infectious diseases, all commence with the germ theory of disease. Persons never realize, and even some people today don't even want to believe it, that these infectious diseases are actually caused by an organism. And it was only after the microscope was improved to the point that persons can actually look into the microscope and see these things with their naked eye, with the microscope itself, that persons took it seriously, because it was unheard of to think that something as tiny as a little virus or a little bacteria can make some person sick and actually cause their death. So people didn't believe that this was possible until they actually started to see some of these organisms. So just to look at a few definitions, an infectious disease just means that the disease is caused by either by a microorganism, either a bacteria or a virus or fungus or a parasite, a worm, anything like that. this is referred to as infectious disease. And Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, you'll hear a little more about these as we continue in Germany, were kind of rivals, but really they pushed infectious diseases into the future and they actually modernize it. And we still use a lot of their findings today. If you would have done biology to any advanced level, you would have heard about Koch's postulates, which actually lays the platform for a lot of what we understand about infectious diseases now. Now, a contagious disease is a disease that can be spread from one person to another. So in effect, an infectious disease is not necessarily a contagious disease, because you can have an infectious disease like tetanus, and that is not spread. That actually produces a toxin which infects the person and can lead to death, but is not spread from one person to another. All right, but you can have a contagious disease like influenza, or even like the coronavirus, which is a contagious disease where one person can spread it to another person. All right, so we need to make sure that we clarify those two. And then we've also heard about virulence or virulent, which means extremely severe or harmful in its effects. So some infectious diseases are very virulent, and then some are not very virulent, leading to death. Okay. And I can mention here now that a lot of the extremely virulent infectious diseases, they use for bioterrorism, things like Ebola and some of those. So they actually keep them and they use them. Ebola was actually used in Iraq for bioterrorism. I see the person that's changing my slides just walked away, but we will go on. The simplest way a disease can spread from a person to a person is through contact transmission. There are different ways that diseases can spread. And contact, just to give you two examples, Ebola, we saw with Ebola that if persons touch the body fluids of the person who had Ebola, then they got Ebola, and it was extremely deadly. And then MRSA, most of you might have heard about Staphylococcus aureus. And then there's a resistant Staphylococcus aureus that is now in the US, a community spread. And by touching a person's skin that have it, then it can be transmitted. So this is contact transmission. Now, droplet transmission. These are visible droplets that come out of you when you sneeze, or it come out of your mouth or you vomit, and influenza and coronavirus are spread by droplet. I know recently you've been hearing a lot about coronavirus and airborne, but this has not been proven yet, so I'm not going to go into that realm. But what has been proven is droplet suspension in the air up to about 6 feet, and then you can catch it like that. Now, airborne transmission means a disease can spread through a miniature droplet that are really invisible, that are suspended in the air. And this means that after you leave the room, they're still suspended in the air and you can become infectious. Okay, you can be infected because you came into their space in the air. And TB, that was airborne, and measles was also airborne, and smallpox, things like smallpox, was also airborne. Now we're going to get in a little bit to outbreaks, epidemics, and pandemics. An outbreak or an epidemic, we tend to give both of them the same definition, but yet when we refer to them slightly differently. Is occurrence of more cases of disease than expected in a given area or among a specific group of people over a particular period of time. And usually the cases are presumed to be of a common nature, similar. But you would hear us refer to something like a salmonella outbreak if we have like a group of persons who would have ate at a particular restaurant and they got salmonella poisoning. We refer to that as a salmonella outbreak. In terms of epidemic now, we usually refer to epidemic when it's a wider scale. okay? Even though the English language gives them the same definition, we refer to them differently. And a pandemic is defined as an epidemic occurring worldwide. In other words, before the WHO, World Health Organization, can refer to something as a pandemic, it would have had to touch a number of countries, like sometimes over 165 countries, etc. So it would have crossed international boundaries and affect a large number of people. So pandemics, thank you. Throughout history, the greatest mortality in humans has been from infectious diseases like viruses and bacteria and parasites. Sometimes we like to think, or we might feel that a hurricane or earthquake or a volcano might cause more destruction. But really and truly, the most or the greatest destruction we have had, or mortality deaths among humans, was through infectious diseases. And over the millennium, epidemics and pandemics in particular have been mass killers on a wide scale. We can't even begin to imagine. And just to look to your right, this just gives you an idea of every 100 years, we're seeing another plague, another pandemic. So in 1720, we saw the plague, then we had cholera, we had Spanish flu, now coronavirus, almost 100 years, one after the other. But I'm going to touch a bit more than what we have mentioned there. And I'm actually going to start with smallpox. Smallpox was caused by one of two viruses, variant viruses, variola major and variola minor. And from as early as Bible times, the origin of smallpox was unknown, but yet it was seen in Egyptian mummies in the 3rd century. And it had symptoms like fever and vomiting, skin rash. And the skin rash actually came out in pustules and bumps. So this was smallpox. And transmission was through droplet, through people, human beings, but by droplet, and it was also airborne and contaminated objects. So if you lie on your bed with smallpox, then the sheet and the bed linen and everything could become contagious and it can affect. So you had to make sure you use gloves to wash bed linen, etc. In the 18th century, Europe estimated that 400,000 people per year, this is every year, died from the disease. And 3 kings actually died from smallpox. And 1/3 of the cases resulted in blindness. So even if you didn't die, then you were left blind. And 300 million people in the 20th century and 500 million people in the last 100 years actually died from smallpox. But the last naturally occurring case was diagnosed in October 1977. This is of smallpox. But what the World Health Organization had to do is in 1967, after there were 15 million cases, they decided we need to do something. So they just urgently just threw everything at it. And they intensified their efforts. And by 1980, smallpox was eradicated. But I would also say to you that even though it has been eradicated, there is still some smallpox in most of the large laboratories, and they're actually keeping them for bioterrorism. So we have to be so careful. When you see something just get out into society, even though it has been eradicated, it means that there's probably experimentation there. Now, the next pandemic I'm going to mention is the plague, and this was called Justinian, the plague of Justinian, King Justinian, in 541 to 549. And it struck in the 6th century and killed as many as 50 million people. And I'm not talking about cases now, I'm talking about deaths. So it actually killed about 50 million people. possibly half of the global population at that time, because at that time they didn't have billions of people like we have now. They had millions, and there was really no recourse for a lot of these infectious diseases. So if you got it, basically that's it, you died. So this was the beginning of the first plague pandemic caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which was thought to have originated in China. And you would find that a lot of these viruses, bacteria, etc., would have originated in China and Northeast India. And the transmission was caused by the black rat, Rattus rattus, which travel on ships. So they would take the cargo onto the ship, whether it is the wheat or whatever, and they deliver the grain. And as they deliver the grain, they also deliver the infected rat, which cause issues in the particular countries where they went to. The next plague was Black Death. And the Black Death, also known as the pestilence, the great mortality of the plague, this is how it was referred to, was the deadliest pandemic recorded in human history thus far. And the Black Death resulted in the deaths of up to 200 million in Eurasia and North Africa, peaking in Europe from 1347 to 1351. And the bubonic plague, a disease caused by the bacterium Yersinia, which was the black rats as well, originated in China in the early to mid 1300s and spread along trade routes. Again, as they traded, they carried the black rat, and which was already infected, and spread it to westward to the Mediterranean and to North Africa. So this was the Black Death. And then we had the Great Plague of Marseille. I remember just last year when we went on our cruise, we actually visited Marseille with some beautiful buildings. And looking back now, you would see that the Great Plague of Marseille was the last major outbreak of the bubonic plague in Western Europe. But the plague arrived in Marseille, France in 1720, and it killed a total of 100,000 people. This is just in France alone. And then 50,000 in the city during the next 2 years. So remember, this plague didn't last 1 year. So when we talk coronavirus, we don't expect that it will last only 1 year either. So 50,000 in the city during the next 2 years, and another 50,000 to the north in the surrounding provinces and towns. And then we're going to look briefly at tuberculosis. I was actually leaving out this, but then I said, how can I leave out tuberculosis? Tuberculosis is an infectious disease caused by Mycobacterium tuberculosis. And it had many names at the time. It was called consumption. Even up to recently, I heard persons referring to it in my time as consumption. And then phytosis, or it was referred to as King's Evil. And the reason why it was referred to as King's Evil is because when you had tuberculosis, it was thought that if you receive a touch from the king that you would have been healed. And this also caused the life of a number of kings. So it appears likely that Akhenaten and his wife, Nefertiti, both died from tuberculosis. And evidence indicates that hospitals for tuberculosis existed in Egypt as early as 1500 BC. They would have had what we now refer to as sanitariums. They would have had hospitals then. And the Old Testament also mentions a consumptive illness that would affect the Jewish people if they stray from God. You see how they kind of link things back to God at the particular time. Now, the ancient Hebrew word kashifeth, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, is used in Deuteronomy and Leviticus to describe TB. But bring us now back down to Barbados and to the West Indies at the time. In 1751, George Washington came to Barbados with his half-brother Lawrence And if you have visited George Washington House, you would have heard the history of this. But Lawrence was very young, and George Washington was a young boy as well. But Lawrence had TB. And in those days, they had to travel by boat. So traveling 6 weeks by boat, George Washington also contracted TB from his half brother, Lawrence. And they came down to Barbados. Suffice it to say that while George Washington was in Barbados, he also contracted smallpox. So, you know, these were things that were prominent. And you might have heard about the Moyne Commission. At that particular time, healthcare was just atrocious. And it was because there was no real care for a lot of the Blacks and the slaves at the time. And in terms of TB, it was also felt that if you came to a sunny, bright country, then you will get better because you would see you would have all the fresh air and sunshine and everything. So you had droves of TB people, persons infected with TB, coming to the Caribbean and coming to Barbados to get better, and then infecting all the other persons as well. So in 1843, they decided to start building sanitariums. So you might have heard from Ellen G. White about some of the sanitariums that were built at the time to house people, especially those persons with TB. But even though they were housed and they were, you know, treated with quote unquote healthy foods and fruits, etc., about 50% of them would die after 5 years. So it was still a death threat at that time. In 1869, Jean-Antoine Villemin demonstrated that the disease was indeed contagious. So people then realized, up to that time, people really didn't realize that it was contagious. So they realized that you had to keep your distance and you had to stay away from persons that had TB. In 1882, Robert Koch, and we did mention Koch, and Koch has done a lot in terms of infectious disease. He revealed the disease was caused by an infectious agent. And at the beginning of the 20th century, tuberculosis was one of UK's most urgent health problems. So then they identify it as a major problem. So in 1901, they established the Royal Commission. And in 1902, they had an international conference to start to look at TB and see how they could address some of the concerns. And in 1906, a vaccine was actually developed, and I'll mention this a bit later when I start to look at vaccines. But the BCG was only administered to humans in 1921. So you see how long it took from development of the vaccine then for it to seem safe enough to be given to human beings throughout the world. All right, so tuberculosis infects nearly 2 billion people worldwide. 2 billion, so this is a lot of persons, with around 10.4 million new cases of TB each year. So even though we have the vaccine and everything, up to today, we're still seeing cases of TB, especially linked to HIV. Now, in Barbados, we had pretty much gotten rid of TB, but now that we have HIV in the Caribbean, you would find 1 or 2 cases. Not a lot of cases, but definitely you will still see a few cases. In 2018, an estimated 10 million incident TB cases and 1.5 million TB deaths. So from as early as it started, it is still with us up to today. Next is cholera. We had a cholera pandemic in 1817 to 1824. And the first cholera pandemic was known as the first Asiatic cholera pandemic, or originating near Calcutta in India and spread throughout the South and Southeast Asia to the Middle East, Eastern Africa, and the Mediterranean coast. reaching as far as China. So this spread wide and far, this cholera outbreak. And this was the first of several pandemics to sweep throughout Asia and Europe during the 19th and 20th centuries. And the total deaths remain unknown, but it is speculated that the death toll was over 8 million. So a lot of persons would have died from cholera. Cholera actually, at that time, used to infiltrate the water. So a lot of persons would have come in contact with cholera through stool and water. So 7 cholera pandemics have occurred in the past 200 years. This is pandemics, meaning spreading throughout the world. But you have pockets of cholera, because the last time we would have probably heard a little bit about cholera was in Haiti, when they had the earthquake, and then they had some development of cholera that they wanted to blame it on the UN, etc. In 1991 to 1994, there was an outbreak in South America. And more recently in 2016 to 20, Yemen had a cholera outbreak. Now, coming down to influenza, we first started with the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918. And this was caused by H1N1. You might have heard about H1N1 because there's actually a vaccine. So the H1N1 Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 was considered the deadliest in history. And to me, we should have learned a lot from this pandemic, even if it's just by reading. And it infected more than 500 million people worldwide. We haven't reached that number yet in terms of coronavirus. And a third of the planet's population was infected, and it killed over 20 to 50 million people, including 675,000 Americans. All right, so the Spanish flu did a lot of damage in 1918. Well, it's actually between 1918 and 1920. And it had 2 waves. The first wave of the pandemic occurred in the spring and was generally mild. So you had a pandemic, but it was relatively mild. Persons got sick, persons got better. However, a second highly contagious wave of influenza appeared with a vengeance in the fall of the same year. So you had the spring and then you had the fall. And victims died within hours or days of contracting the virus, with symptoms of blue skin. And even now with the coronavirus, they're saying to you, if you're starting to turn blue, that's an emergency. You know, you need to get to the hospital, you need to call ahead right away. And lungs filling with fluid, we're seeing similar things now that cause them to suffocate. So similarly, we're seeing stuff like that. And America's average life expectancy just dropped. Right now, most countries have a life expectancy of like 75, 76 years old, some even higher. But at that time, the American life expectancy dropped to 36 in males and 42 in females. So you can see how low that life expectancy was. It actually dropped. Now, looking at influenza again in 2013, it was caused by H1N1 pandemic, 2013 to 2014. The Italian word influence of the stars is how influenza actually got its name, from the Italian word. And it was caused by a virus, and the influenza virus has 8 genes. And they mutate and they shuffle genes. So that's why it's so difficult to get a vaccine that works. There's a vaccine, but it doesn't work very well. And it spreads by droplet, coughing, sneezing, and then flu can have a wide spectrum of illness. As you know, there 25% of persons can be asymptomatic. In other words, you have the flu, but you really don't have any symptoms, but yet you can still be spreading it to persons. And then you can have an upper respiratory tract infection. You have a cough, you have fever, muscle ache, sounding familiar, and pains, We're seeing a lot of this with the coronavirus now. And some persons can actually develop pneumonia and some can die. And usually very old and very young and persons with underlying conditions can also have very adverse effects, similar to what we're suggesting now, except for the very young. With the coronavirus, they're not saying that the very young, even though we're seeing more and more young people contracting the virus. Now, the influenza is really a zoonosis, avian or bird flu. Birds are actually the reservoir for influenza. And it can also affect other animals like pigs. So we would have had the swine flu at one stage. And in 1997, we had H5N1, which appeared in Hong Kong. And in China, the source of the influenza, humans and birds, originated from the wet markets. You would have seen that probably one of my earlier presentations, that China have a lot of wet markets, and they do a lot of slaughtering in their markets. So the fact that there's fresh meat, you know, this also helps with the spread. Fresh meat slaughtering on the spot. And then they also have poultry markets with birds. And not, when I say poultry markets, it's not just chickens. They have all different types of poultry, that all different types of birds, etc., that they slaughter and they sell. If you want anything exotic, you can go to a China market and you can get almost anything that you can think about, dog, cat, whatever, in a China market. Now, in 2009, H1N1 pandemic from Mexico, the swine flu, lasted 19 months. Notice, 19 months it lasted. So some of these pandemics can go on for a while, not necessarily 6 months or 1 year, but it can go on a bit longer. And there were 700 million to 1.4 billion infected and 284,000 deaths. And an average of 250,000 die annually from the flu. This is up to today. People don't realize it, but a lot of persons die every year from influenza, from the flu. So next we look at the HIV pandemic, and notice I'm trying to go very briefly, so I'm not exhausting any of these pandemics, but 1984 was when we first learned about HIV, and right up to now, 2020, it is still very much there. Now, HIV is a pandemic that is not infectious. So in other words, it is infectious, it is not contagious. Mind you, don't misquote me now. It is infectious, yes, but it is not contagious. In other words, you can't get it spreading like droplet, etc. It is spread sexually. So it is the human immunodeficiency virus, and it infects, but is not contagious. And transmission is by sexual contact, obviously through blood as well, blood products. And this is not by touching them, but you know, if you have to get a blood transfusion or blood products being transfused, if you get donated semen or any type of organ, or from an infected mother to child, either through delivery or through breast milk. But now there's certain things, treatments that they put in place, so you don't necessarily antiretroviral treatments get through delivery. But some persons can still breastfeed and transmit it. Now there are 75.7 million people have become infected with HIV since the start of the epidemic. This is a lot of persons. And 32.7 million people have died from AIDS-related illnesses since the start of the epidemic. And if we look at 2019 alone, there were 38 million people globally are living with HIV in 2019, and 1.7 million people became newly infected in 2019. That's between January and December 2019. 1.7 million people became infected, newly infected, and 690,000 people died from AIDS-related illness. This is in 2019 alone. All right, so HIV is still very much with us. And 25.4 million people were accessing antiretrovirals. This is the treatment that you give. And remember, a virus can be treated but not cured. So in other words, it will still continue. So all this treatment does is helps the HIV patient to live longer, but it doesn't mean it will prevent them from having HIV anymore. This is not the case. Now, Ebola, just briefly to mention, Ebola is a viral disease and it was discovered first in 1976 in Zaire, which is now referred to as the Dominican Republic of the Congo and Sudan. And it was spread from bats. You would find a lot of these infectious diseases are spread from animals, things like bats and rats, etc. So it was spread from bats to other primates and blood products. And there were 25 outbreaks, most of them centered in Central Africa. And there are 5 different strains of the virus. That's another thing about a lot of these infectious agents is that they have different strains. So because they have different strains and because they mutate, it is very difficult to deal with them. So Zaire and Sudan strains cause most of the disease, these 2 areas, the strains from these 2 areas. And Ebola causes a severe systemic infection infecting the body and all the organ systems. Now you might have watched a picture called Ebola or infection or something like that. And it really played it up. It showed people bleeding out and all that, but some of this is actually true because half of the people have a hemorrhagic manifestation or manifestations where they bleed, and they bleed from different puncture wounds and different sites. About 50% of the people with Ebola might bleed out. And you can also have bloody diarrhea, blood coming from your eyes, things like this can actually happen. But the mortality is extremely high, nothing like the coronavirus now. Coronavirus now, the mortality is just like 5% or so. But from Ebola, the mortality could be up to 90%. And in 2013 to 2014, West Africa outbreak was aggressive care and survival. So then I guess they learned a bit more by then. And with the aggressive care, the mortality rate was not as high as 90%. It was moving down more like 50%. So now we come to SARS-CoV-2, which we see as a new coronavirus. And SARS-CoV-2 originated in bats, and it also originated in China. All right, and the special coronaviruses have jump species and can be transmitted between people. So as we saw with a lot of the other infectious diseases, they were initially from virus to animal, and then they jumped species and came to humans. So this is actually the 3rd coronavirus to have done so, to have jumped species since 2002. So in 2002, we saw severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS, and this emerged in China, and this was thought to emerge from the civet cat. And the civet cat is one of the things that you get in the wet market, where they get these cats and they skin them and kill them and sell them. All right, and then the Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome, or MERS, emerged in the Middle East in 2012, and this was thought to emerge from camels. And now we're seeing the SARS-CoV-2, which emerged in Wuhan, China in 2019. So the transmission is by droplet, and it's suggested that the droplet can travel up to 6 feet. And that is why at first they were saying, make sure you distance yourself 3 feet from the individual. Now they're saying, make sure you keep 6 feet distance, because it seems as though the droplets can suspend in the air up to 6 feet, especially if you're singing, if you're coughing, things like that. So some people have no symptoms or they're asymptomatic, but yet these persons that are asymptomatic can still spread the virus. They might not be as contagious as the persons that are symptomatic, but when you're asymptomatic, you are still contagious. So up to 80% of people have mild disease. Some people have a more serious disease that can lead to death. And you would find persons with things like fever, tiredness, fatigue, chills, muscle pain, cough, loss of taste or smell, difficulty breathing, headache, sore throat, shortness of breath, chest pain, turning blue, getting confused. These are some of the symptoms that you would see. But what you must realize is not every individual will have all of these symptoms. There were some persons here in Barbados that were diagnosed with coronavirus who only had loss of taste and loss of smell, no other symptoms whatsoever. So if you judge a person like that and come in contact with them, you would feel that, you know, there's absolutely nothing wrong with them as far as coronavirus is concerned. But in fact, yes, you can contract it like that because one such person would have spread it to a nephew. And all he had was loss of taste, loss of smell. So the SARS-CoV-2 incubation period ranges from 2 to 14 days. And it becomes infectious 2 days before any signs at all. So before you start sneezing or coughing or anything, 2 days before you can still be spreading it to persons. And this really helps us to understand that if you're asymptomatic, you can still spread it. So in fact, for those 2 days when you were pre-symptomatic, you were spreading it. So if you're asymptomatic, you will still be spreading it too. So you have to be very careful. And that's why persons are saying to you, make sure you wear your mask, make sure you keep your physical distance, make sure you practice good hygiene, etc., because you're not sure who really has the virus. So more at risk are the elderly, obese persons, and you have heard Dr. Duglin talking a lot about obesity and putting you at risk, not just for contracting, but for death, okay? And persons with underlying conditions like diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, you know, all different types of underlying conditions can cause more severe effects of the coronavirus. So let us just look briefly as we come down to the end at the global and the Barbados level. There are over 19 million cases, confirmed cases. Now remember, when we talk microbiology, we say that for every confirmed case, there are probably 3 others out there that you don't know about, all right? So we know about 19 confirmed cases, but obviously there are more cases. And when we look at deaths, there's 720,000 deaths, but we have to look to see how each country is measuring their deaths. Are they really saying that every person who would have contracted the coronavirus and count that as a death despite the fact that they died of heart disease or despite the fact that they died of pneumonia or whatever? So we have to see how they're counting deaths. So on average, so let's say average, there's 720,000 deaths globally. In terms of Barbados, we've seen to date 138 confirmed cases and only 7 deaths. All right, it doesn't have to be a deadly disease, as I said. You know, most persons will recover when they have the virus. But if we look at some of our Caribbean brothers and sisters, and I'm not really going to go in too much into the Dominican Republic, but so much to say that because Haiti is bounded by the Dominican Republic, we saw that Haiti started out with less cases than Barbados and quickly flew up to over 7,000 cases and 177 deaths. All right, because when you have boundaries that are next to each other, to police those boundaries is going to be difficult. So you get a lot of transmission across boundaries. And Suriname, similarly, Suriname, I spent some time in Suriname, and they have a lot of persons coming into Suriname from Brazil. They actually come in and go into the hinterland and they do mining, etc. So they can easily come across the borders to do their mining and whatever and cause a lot of problems in Suriname. So we're seeing that Suriname have over 2,000 cases. But Jamaica now, very early, when most of the Caribbean had their borders locked down, Jamaica decided, okay, we're going to open back up our borders and allow our nationals to come back into Jamaica. And so every day you see the 29 in brackets, that was 29 new cases from yesterday alone. So every day they're getting between 8 and 30 cases of returning nationals. And they're allowing all the returning nationals to come in. But now what they're also doing is that they're no longer government quarantining, similar to us, because it reaches a point where the government can't afford to keep all these persons in quarantine and feed them 3 meals a day and, you know, provide shelter and provide workers, etc. So the decision was taken, I guess, throughout the Caribbean that we are going to allow persons to quarantine at home. So you have some Jamaicans that quarantine at home and decide they're going to church. So you had infection in the church and they decide they were going to the supermarket and they decide they were going different places. So now there's a lot of community spread in Jamaica. So you have persons turning up at the hospital with coronavirus, and even that is dangerous. But this is the situation. So now there's another lockdown. Similarly, in Bahamas, we've seen that Bahamas have quickly risen to 830. And again, this is because, you know, we're allowing commercial flights again. We have to make sure that we get some tourism, etc. And we allow our people to come back home and spend some money. And therefore, that is the situation. So now again, Bahamas is talking about locking down our restrictions, because locking down is probably not the best term to use, but implementing some restrictive measures. Okay. Now we're also seeing in Guyana that they're like 538. Now remember, Guyana is right next to Suriname. They have a common border. And again, persons from Brazil, etc., can come into Guyana as well. And Aruba. Now Aruba is extremely small. And Brother Saul might know that. I don't know if he has been there, but I understand he was born there. But we actually went to Aruba on one of our cruises, and Aruba has a very small, is a small country, has a small population. And for Aruba to have 509 cases, that is extremely high. And only yesterday, 113 new cases in Aruba. So again, that could be tourism or returning nationals or whatever. But once you have travel, you will have cases. But fortunate for them, there were only 3 deaths, which is good. All right. Then we have Martinique, Trinidad. Trinidad, again, it seems as though Trinidad does have community spread now too. They have 225 cases. But again, Trinidad was very reluctant to open up, but eventually, as they allow persons back in, you're seeing more and more cases. And because you're self-home quarantining, persons are going out into the community and doing as they please. Now, Cayman, a very small country, 203 cases, and Bermuda, even smaller than Cayman, 157 cases. So we're seeing more and more cases in the Caribbean, to the point that, to my amazement, the US is saying to their tourists, don't go to the Caribbean, don't go to Barbados, because there are lots of cases in those Caribbean countries and you might not be able to get the proper treatment, etc. So, and nobody's looking at the amount of cases in the US, which is really, really high. All right, so when we look at treatment of infectious diseases, back in the 1900s, there was nothing that you could really do. You got an infectious disease and that was it. The next step was probably death. All right. But then there came a breakthrough when scientists realized that there were certain dyes that would dye tissues, that would stain tissues, and that would also stain some of the viruses and the bacteria. So it helped you to understand further the type of bacteria it was. So if certain bacteria took up a particular stain, so in histology and in microbiology, some bacteria was stain gram negative. And we would know that those particular bacteria can be treated a certain way. So this kind of laid a platform then for the first antibiotics and antibacterials that were discovered. And these were the sulfur drugs like Bactrim. Then we also had arsenic, which was used to treat syphilis. This was right in the very early days. But the biggest breakthrough that came from Alexander Fleming. And Alexander Fleming, as some of you would know, discovered penicillin. But the way he discovered penicillin was very, very interesting, because he actually left a dish out. You know, sometimes you leave some bread and it starts to form mold. And, you know, if you leave it longer, you will see a lot of spores and mold all through it. So this is exactly what Alexander Fleming did. He left a dish. It wasn't really stated if it was bread or food or whatever, but he left it over the weekend. And when he came back, he discovered there was a lot of mold. But apart from being a scientist, a British scientist, apart from realizing it was a lot of mold, he also probably looked at it and realized that it was killing some of the bacteria. So this led him then to write up an article to show that this fungus, which was later called penicillin, was actually killing the bacteria so that they can use it. But he never really used it to treat human beings. So Howard Florey and Ernest Chain then got together and decided to use this penicillin to treat human beings, to kill bacteria. And therefore, all three of them together received the Nobel Prize. So both Alexander Fleming, Howard Florey, and Ernest Chain received the Nobel Prize together. But Fleming, in his Nobel Prize lecture, warned against antibiotic resistance. And today we're seeing a lot of antibiotic resistance. Even now with the coronavirus, you hear people talking about, oh, give them make sure you give them some antibiotics. And really and truly, antibiotics cannot treat viruses. I remember in the early days, persons coming back from the US and saying to my husband, oh, we need to get antibiotics. And my husband would be saying to them, but you have a cold. You can't get antibiotics to treat a cold, to treat the flu. But because they're accustomed abusing it in the US, they're demanding it down here and think that they know very well. So you have to be careful of situations like this. If you're using the antibiotics for secondary infection, well, yes. But if you're using it to treat a virus, then no. So anyway, antifungals treats fungus. Anti-worm medicine would treat worms. Antivirals would help with viral infections. And then the antibiotics treat bacteria. In the early times, there were some not so early because Ebola was kind of recent, experimental drugs like ZMapp for Ebola. But then you had to get emergency authorization to use this. And I suspect that that is what would happen to some of the vaccines, because they're not quite ready. They will have emergency authorization to use some of the vaccines until they have been deemed safe enough. So this brings me now to vaccines. Right. Now, a vaccine is one of the best ways of tackling an infectious disease. Okay. But people have benefited from vaccines through the years, and it has helped to increase the lifespan. We saw in the early days when persons had a lot of these infectious diseases, over 500 million persons died and 200 million persons, etc., because there were really no vaccines, no antivirals, nothing to really treat. It's a matter of getting it and dying. Now, the first vaccine was for smallpox, and smallpox is now eradicated. But this was Edward Jenner that actually discovered this particular vaccine. And in the second one was the rabies vaccine with Louis Pasteur. He understanding how vaccines work. So he started to understand from Jenner how vaccines work, and he was able then to develop a rabies vaccine. And in 1906, there was the vaccine for TB, or what we consider the BCG. Now, the history of BCG vaccine starts with Albert Calmet and Camille Guerin. And these are two French scientists who from 1905 started to working to develop this vaccine against TB. And this BCG vaccine, oops, sorry, was then used in 1921. So from 1905, they started developing. So they had finished developing by 1906. And then they had to go through all the vaccine trials. It's not easy just to develop a vaccine and then use it on human beings. You had to do animal trials. You had to use small amount of persons, then larger amount of persons. You had to look at the side effects, etc. So it took them almost 20 years, probably over 15 years, for them to really get from development to the actual use. Now today, we're expecting a vaccine in 1 year or in a couple months, which is almost impossible. So currently, a host of childhood vaccines are now in use. And I must warn, as Christians, some persons have complacency. They don't want their children to be vaccinated because they figure something is going to happen to them. And then there's a whole anti-vaccine movement. And we have to be careful as Christians how we question certain things that God has educated us and helped us to understand along the way to benefit mankind. So we have to be very careful about that. So we do have a vaccine now for influenza, but it is not the best. We have an H1N1 vaccine, but it's really only 60% effective. And this is because they're over, I had mentioned to you, over 8 strains, but there are actually 4 strains in this particular vaccine. And they try to change it every year to suit what they think is happening in society at the particular time. So if they think that these are the strains that are manifesting, then they would try to tweak the vaccine and change it around that they can include the particular 4 strains to benefit the population. But again, every year you see persons, because I remember 1 year I actually had the vaccine, and I still got the flu in January. I had the vaccine in October. So I was actually saying to my husband, well, look, I got the vaccine, I still get the flu, right? So it's not as effective as some persons would think. And then we have the RVSV and the ZBOC vaccine. This is a single dose vaccine, and this is for Ebola. So this is only against the Zaire Ebola virus. So in other words, the other strains of the Ebola virus, there's no vaccine, but there is one against this particular one, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it will work perfect either. So coming to the end now, vaccines continue. Vaccines normally require years of testing and additional time to produce at scale. When we say at scale, that means that you can produce to give persons all over the world. But scientists are hoping to develop a corona vaccine in 12 to 18 months. And this is going to be difficult because even though you have the vaccine, as I mentioned, you have to go through phase 1, which is animals, phase 2, which is a small amount of human beings, and then phase 3 is a larger amount, and then you have to look to see what are the side effects, what are the issues, and then you have to go back and tweak it. So this is the case. Right now, there are 5 vaccines in phase 3 clinical trials, and where all the scientists are hoping to have a number of effective vaccines that can help prevent people from infection. However, there is no silver bullet, and this is what is stated by Tedros, the head of the World Health Organization. He says there is no silver bullet at the moment, and there might never be. And he's so right. You know, persons are looking for this silver bullet to cure them against the coronavirus, but they might never be. WHO knows of 160 potential COVID-19 vaccines in development and 26 in human trials. But as I mentioned, there are only 5 that are looking almost ready, that are in phase 3. But even when you're in phase 3, there's still a long way to go, okay? Now, most experts agree that it is unlikely that these vaccines are going to work across all age groups and commodities. We might see success, but we might see it in a subset of the subjects. So in other words, even if there's a vaccine, it doesn't mean that it will work for everyone. It might work for some people and not some people, just like the influenza vaccine. Because coronavirus is quite similar to influenza in some ways. So, and there are lots and lots of strains as well. So that is going to be a major issue. So my last slide now is on prevention. I'm not going to spend a long time because you would have heard Dr. Douglin talk a lot about prevention, but there's some things that throughout the years, persons were asked to do in terms of infectious diseases. Wash your hands. There was actually one person that encouraged doctors to wash their hands before they saw patients. You would think that this would be taken for granted, but after noting that there were bacteria and germs around, then they had to develop sanitizing instruments in the hospital. Then there were some persons that developed that. Then some persons that recommended wearing what we see now as surgical masks so that you wouldn't be spreading anything to the patient. Washing hands, wearing gloves. These are things that we take for granted, but these are things that are important. So washing your hands, you can never wash your hands enough. Practicing coughing etiquette, making sure you wear your mask, and as well as, you know, if you have to cough in a cuff or in tissue, whatever, but wearing mask is essential. And avoid contact, making sure you keep those 6 feet distance. Don't relapse it to 3. Make sure you keep the 6 feet, because in the event that it is airborne, you need to make sure that you keep your distance, okay? And then in terms of eating properly, make sure you boost your immune system. Make sure you keep eating your fruits, your vegetables, taking your D3, making sure you keep trim and fit, exercising. All of these things are important in terms of prevention. But I would caution you that it's possible to do everything that you think is right and still contract an infectious disease. But then how your body deals with it is the important part. Okay, so I want to stop there now. I am not sure if my time is gone, but I would you can tell me if there are any time for 2 questions. If not, I would turn back over to Dr. Duglin.
Yes, you can have a few questions allowed. So any questions for the presenter?
Yes, I have one here.
Go ahead.
Yes, I know our time has gone, but
I'll stop
you
sharing.
said
Good.
you said at one point that some vaccines have not been effective for all persons. You mentioned one at 60%, the influenza. But has there ever been a time when a vaccination or vaccine rather has been harmful to persons? Have you found anything like that in your research?
Yeah. If a vaccine is harmful, it is usually a one-off situation. And it is possible because even here, what they say to you at the Ministry of Health is if there are any adverse effects from the vaccine, you come back and you let us know. So there might be persons who might feel really sick, who might develop a flu after taking the vaccine, and then you go back and you say it to them. As a matter of fact, if you are sick or if you have the flu, they recommend that you don't take the vaccine at that particular time. Okay, but there is a one-off situation where the vaccine might make you sick because of your constitutional makeup, and not that there's anything wrong with the vaccine per se. So that is a possibility, but it is not widespread. I'm trying to see what is in the chat. Oh, that was some person saying audio gone. Okay. Yeah, sorry, please. My husband was supposed to pray to start, and I thought he did when I was glancing through my slides. So we will pray to end, but he was supposed to pray and introduce me. So my apologies for that part. I'm now seeing that in the chat too, because I couldn't see the chat before, mind you. All right, if there's nothing, no other questions, I can close with prayer before we open to the other section. All right, let's bow our heads. Dear kind and loving Father, we'd like to thank you for giving me this information that I was able to share with others. We know that we're in a particular situation here now with this COVID-19, and we're seeing persons becoming ill. We're even seeing some deaths. Even when we think that things are getting better, we see that things are getting worse. Even in the US, in the UK, and even in the Caribbean, we're seeing more and more cases. We're asking you to continue to give us good health, to continue to give us knowledge and wisdom that we may practice all of the public health measures that you would have shared with us over the years, dear Father. We ask you to help us to educate other persons that they too may come to understand the things that they should do. But most importantly, dear Father, we're asking you to draw us all closer to you, that we can get to know you better. We've had a wonderful camp meeting, and we've had some wonderful health sessions, dear Father, as we kind of fortify ourselves with the truths that you've been presenting to us and the health information, dear Father. Help that we may put it into practice, and help that we may study more urgently. We ask you to continue to guide and direct everyone here on this Zoom platform now, and other persons who would be watching on YouTube. Continue to guide and direct us all now, for Christ's sake. Amen.
Well, we thank Sister Duglin very much for her presentation, and we thank all who have joined. We'll give you a few minutes break, and then we reassemble for our Camp 2020 closing ceremony, and that will be under the coordination of Elder John Eric Graves. So take a 5-minute breather, and we reassemble for a closing ceremony. And we thank God again for the day and for the health lecture and for everything. But we'll come back to our closing ceremony after a 5-minute break. And Elder John Eric Graves will be coordinating that closing ceremony. So a few minutes break.